where do we start this talk on defending Christmas, and why are we defending Christmas at all? I'll tell you what. Today we're going to talk about Christmas trees, and tomorrow, jolly old St. Nicholas. And here's the thing. We don't really do Santa with our kids. Never have. In fact, they only learned who he was because of friends and, going out to the store and whatnot and wondering who this guy is and all red. Christmas trees, we've always had a Christmas tree at the house, and we do Christmas with our kids. And we have a Christmas tree in our house. But if I never had a Christmas tree again, I wouldn't shed a tear. It's just my personality, my thing. Like, it's a lot of work, putting up all these lights and all this kind of stuff. But my wife would not be happy. But the catch is that I've got no problem with a Christmas tree, but there is some stuff I do have problems with. And this is in the areas of truth and hermeneutics, okay? And this is where I have issues when I'm like watching people online who are attacking Christmas traditions. Some are, more biblically rooted, and other ones, again, are more tradition. But they're treating them like they're pagan and horrible, and how dare you want to have a Christmas tree or even make mention of Santa Claus, which, and all these things. And it's like, well, ouch, I don't like that. And it's not that I don't like that they're attacking Christmas. I don't like that they're saying false things. That is a huge pet peeve of mine. Truth. Some of you may be familiar that I have a habit of sometimes going on and actually defending teachers from churches that I would never, ever advise someone to listen to this guy. But there's a lot of witch hunters these days. There's something really cool about, you got to be super holy. You want to know how to be holy? Hate these people. It's like, well, I don't know that's what holy is. But they attack people and they slander their statements. And I go on and I listen. I pull up a sermon and I listen 2 minutes before and 2 minutes after the 2-second clip that they play of someone, and they say, look how much of a heretic he is. And I listen and I go, that's not what he was saying at all. I don't really like this guy. I don't think he's a good teacher, but he's not what they're calling him. And I'll defend them because I want to defend the truth. And so this morning, as I watched a video of a guy attacking Christmas trees, Christmas stars, Santa Claus, and everything under the sun, the one thing I didn't see was any evidence, any real history. And so, Christian, before I just get going into this, understand that you need to know what you believe and why you believe it, and don't just trust what people say. And you can't just trust what I say. I'm going to try and give you facts, but hopefully you can Google those facts and you can look up reliable sources that'll verify the things that I'm saying. And secondly is hermeneutics. Now, the art and science of biblical interpretation, right? How we interpret our Bibles, but even how we interpret truth. And I just want to remind you guys that when we make statements like, we shouldn't do this because of that, that's a hermeneutic. It's like a way of thinking. It's an if-then. If this, then that. Well, if we say, if this, then that, we need to be able to use that logic consistently. Which is why earlier I made the point that if you don't like Christmas and you don't think we should celebrate Christmas, then you're not allowed to have sex. And I'll get to that in a little bit. That keeps you guys watching. So, let's talk about Christmas trees. One of the scriptures I've seen people use to try and argue against Christmas trees is Jeremiah chapter 10. So let's take a look at Jeremiah chapter 10, verses 2-4, really briefly. Thus says the Lord, do not learn the way of the Gentiles. Do not be dismayed at the signs of heaven, for the Gentiles are dismayed at them, for the customs of the people are futile. For one cuts a tree from the forest, the work of the hands of a workman with an axe. They decorate it with silver and gold. They fasten it with nails and hammers so that it will not topple. Sounds a little bit like Christmas trees, doesn't it? The problem here is it has nothing to do with Christmas trees. And if you read the rest of Jeremiah, in fact, if you just read the Bible, you're familiar with Isaiah has a slightly similar section where they talk about, yes, that people cut down trees to make idols out of wood. Isaiah talks about how you cut down the tree and you're worshiping this part, But then on this part, you're using it to cook the food. And the point is that they would cut down trees. And if you look in verse 3 where it says the work of the hands of a workman with an axe, it's talking about someone with an axe working that tree to carve it into an image. And if you read more in this chapter and other chapters, it talks about how these things cannot see, they cannot walk, they cannot talk. Well, no, duh, a tree doesn't see, talk, and walk. But when you carve a tree into an idol that looks like a person in the form of an idol god, well, that is the type of idols that are being talked about in Jeremiah. And so it just doesn't apply. Now, just as far as just general arguments go, this is a general argument, is that pagans use pine trees or trees in pagan worship. So it's unholy, and therefore, can we worship God, or should we as Christians partake in something that's unholy? Well, let's think about that for a little bit. Firstly, if you read your Bible, there's really no mention of pine trees in pagan worship. There's the acacia groves, but you see actually like the word druid, from the Druid worship, it even has like an etymological root of a oak seer, or the knowledge of the oak is kind of the idea, knower of the oaks, oak trees. There's other trees that oak trees specifically, that have been known to be part of pagan worship, but never really pine or evergreen trees. Some can quote truthfully that in the wintertime, around winter solstice, around the time of Saturnalia and some of these winter pagan holidays, that people would take evergreen trees to decorate inside the house. True. Set them up and decorate them? No. Nowhere in history can you find an example of, during Saturnalia, setting up a tree inside the house to decorate. But in the winter, when all of our beautiful plants have died, there is one plant that would still be alive, and it is those evergreen trees. And it was a normal custom that people would cut pieces of evergreens, they'd hang them on the walls, they'd put them all over the place, not one centralized tree, but decorating with evergreens. This is something that they did just to get some green in the house. It wasn't because they were making a Christmas tree. And I want to finally get two last things to know about this point on, well, we shouldn't do it because the pagans do it. Well, again, since the dawn of time, the pagans have used almost everything in pagan worship. And one that any Christian who has ever read the Old Testament should be very well aware of is sex. Pagans have had pagan sex rituals. So if we're not allowed to do what the pagans do, we probably shouldn't ever have sex ever again. You can pray about that. I already have. I have a peace about my decision. But that's the point. That's that hermeneutic thing. If we're using the argument that the pagans did it, therefore we can't, we're going to find ourselves without anything to do. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul makes it really clear that we know that there's no real such thing as other gods. We know that these idols are nothing. We know there's only one God. But in verse 7, Paul says, however, there is not in everyone that knowledge. For some, with consciousness of the idol, until now eat it as a thing offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Paul actually describes this scenario where people are worried about something being a pagan worship thing is characteristic of a weaker, immature Christian. That the immature believer is worried about doing something that might be pagan. And Paul's like, oh, we know there's only one God. We know it's not the food offered to an idol. And so 1 Corinthians 8, 9, it goes on really, talks about this idea that we need to be sensitive. We actually should. And I'm trying to at least expose some truth here. And I do want to be sensitive. I don't want to mock anyone because they've been taught or misled to think that Christmas trees are evil. It's not my goal at all. But I do want to look at history and what history actually shows. And we're going to get to the history here in just a second. I just want to knock out these first arguments first. But the idea being is that that's actually a sign of an immature Christian. That's what the Bible says. That immature believers are overly worried about worshiping something that could have been idolatry. So, let's start talking about history, shall we? We all are familiar that in the medieval times, Middle Ages, Rome controlled much of the church. And during that time, there were some bad practices. One of which, of course, was that they didn't have a Bible in a language that anyone could read. People couldn't read the Bible. Now, there actually were Greek copies that were being circulated. There was always a Greek church, and there was always a Greek-speaking church. And throughout history, Rose Publishing, I believe it is, Church History Made Easy, go look it up. There were godly Catholic people all through the ages who loved Jesus, loved the Bible, loved the truth, and their beliefs weren't very different from ours. And you find throughout all time, they would usually get kicked out, ostracized. But once again, a lot of these guys, you would find branches of the Roman Catholic Church where they were practicing biblical New Testament Christianity like we do today. But because, there was no internet, there was no telephone, there was no nothing, news never made it back to Rome that these guys were doing this, and so they never got shut down. So the idea that there were no good churches throughout the ages, the Waldenese and the other, I could just go down the line. There's all these groups that were, but on the whole, no. Latin was the language of the church, and so they had to find some way to teach the people, but without speaking the people's language. It was a stupid problem that they made on their own, but that was the problem. And so around the 10th century, the 900s, we see what's called the different plays. There was the miracle plays, the morality plays, and the mystery plays. And these were put on by the church. The church would host these plays. The miracle plays would tell you the story of the life of a saint, right? And morality plays were simply a play that would explain some point of biblical morality. Lastly were the mystery plays. This is where we wanted to be heading. The mystery plays told the story of a story from the Bible. And so it's in these mystery plays that started off in the 10th and 11th century where priests, bishops, people, monks, nuns, I don't know about nuns, but people from the Catholic Church, they would put on these plays to help the people understand their Bible stories and morality and the stories of saints. So, we'll talk about Christmas in December 25th on a future day, but know this, that was the day that the church recognized the birth of Jesus. And it was obviously a day for Christ. The 26th became St. Stephen's Day, the first church martyr. 27th became St. John's Day, the great apostle. And so right around the birth of Christ, they celebrated and remembered, which there's no problem remembering people, famous saints or significant people to the faith. That's going forward from the 25th. Go backwards one day, and the 24th of December was made by the church. And again, I don't know if you can call it accurate or biblical history, but it is historical that the church decided December 24th was Adam and Eve Day. And so they would remember the creation account on December 24th. And that play in the mystery plays was called the Paradise Play. And the church would put on a play with Adam and Eve and Satan and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And they would have this whole thing going on. Well, let me look down to make sure I got my times right. In 1210, the Pope banned the practice of the priests acting on stage. They didn't think the church clergy being actors was very proper. So in 1210, that practice was banned, the practice of the priests, but not of the people. What happened is the job of hosting the mystery and the miracle and morality plays went to the guilds. So we might be familiar with the blacksmith guild and the carpenter guild, all these guilds, these group of professionals, right? They started hosting the plays. And what happened, though, was because the guilds were in charge, they switched it into the language of the people. Then they started poking a little fun at politics. Could you imagine, right? People poking fun at politics and plays and media and whatever. And then they started poking fun at the church a little bit. And then they started poking fun, until finally the Pope just banned them all together. And so by about the 15th century, we see The church just said, we're not going to do these plays anymore because they were turning into big parties. But let's talk about this Paradise play. In the Paradise play, in December 24th, if they had it on the Adam and Eve anniversary, they did these plays throughout the year, but that was the real day that the play had its big festive showing. Places in Northern Europe, Germany, France, Latvia, and Estonia, we'll get to them in a second, they would have to have a tree that didn't look dead, and they needed a forbidden fruit. What would they do? They would find an evergreen tree, the only tree that was still green in December. And what fruit is still kind of alive at that point? And it's apples. You know, people talk about the forbidden fruit of Adam and Eve being an apple. This is where that tradition came from, right? There's nothing in the Bible that says that Adam and Eve ate an apple. But when the Paradise plays were put on 1,000 years ago, apples were the only fruit that they could hang from a tree and use for their play in the dead middle of the winter, or the beginning of winter, I guess. Dead middle of when it's cold. And so this is what the trees would have. They'd have apples on them, and at other times we have record that they would have communion wafers on them, because they would always finish the play with the story of redemption, of Jesus Christ, that there was a solution to this problem that was created in the Garden of Eden. So here we have a green evergreen tree with apples and communion wafers on it. This is historical. It's not biblical. I mean, it's not something from the Bible, but this is the historical record of how this practice began. Now, once these things were banned, you can just imagine that when the government says you can't do church, there's going to be some rebels out there who are still going to do church. Amen? And so when they banned this practice, people still enjoyed this tradition that had been going on for 400 or 500 years. So people like this. So what did they do? They started making their own paradise trees. And so the paradise tree got brought home. And people in the 15th century began to start putting trees in their homes. They decorate them with apples and communion wafers. This was those practices. Now, we know that in December 21st, 1521, okay, this is like right around the time, like 1521 was the Diet of Worms, where Martin Luther said those words, I cannot recant. I cannot go against my conscience. Same year, okay, giving you the ballpark timeline. It's in that year that we have a written record it's in the Humanist Library, which, that is what it is, in Célestat, Alsace in northeast France. I probably didn't pronounce that right, but that's okay. There is this old book you can find, a 500-year-old book, in which we have record of the cost of 4 shillings or whatnot to go and purchase a tree from this forest for the purpose of decorating to have a paradise tree. There are 2 towns, the capital of Estonia, Tallinn, it is the oldest capital in Europe, just fun facts, and Riga of Latvia. These 2 towns, even today, fight over who has the oldest Christmas tree tradition. Tallinn, Estonia claims 1441. I wasn't able to find what their evidence was, but the city claims, as they go back and forth fighting, that they have evidence that they had Christmas trees as early as 1441, Riga, Latvia, 1510. So we're seeing now that the early 16th century, Christmas trees are now just being done by themselves. Now, some places, Christmas trees couldn't be done because wood's a commodity. And in places where people are poor, they couldn't afford just to be wasting trees, especially in some of the more barren lands. What would people do there? They would actually take what little wood they had, and they'd make a small wooden pyramid. Now, you can go to Germany today and other parts of Europe and still see Christmas pyramids being put up. Sometimes you see people who have circular discs that get smaller and smaller. Other times they just construct a wooden triangle. But these things were supposed to be for the people who couldn't afford to put up their own tree. Now, we have record in America that Germans brought over Christmas trees in the 1830s. So we're seeing in America now this idea of a Christmas tree in 1830. But really what got Christmas trees into America and popularized for good was in 1848 when Queen Victoria was married to the German Prince Albert. They put up a German Christmas tree in Windsor Castle. This was drawn by the London Times or the local London newspaper. And once it made it out in the newspaper that Queen Victoria had a Christmas tree, all of England soon followed. And so now you see, boom, Christmas trees blowing up, getting popular, and the tradition has lived on. This history shows us it's not necessarily a biblical thing as like it's something from the Bible that we need to do as Christians. But what we should know is that true Christmas trees, taking an evergreen tree, cutting it down, putting it aside, putting red globes on it, and I forgot to mention that, but over time, the red apples got replaced with red balls. Communion wafers ended up getting replaced with just cookies, and people would cook these white cookies, and they would cut them out in the shapes of nativity characters, because the Christmas tree eventually morphed, and we'll cover this a little bit more tomorrow with St. Nicholas, how many traditions around the Christmas season eventually just morphed into a singular tradition. But we'll find with St. Nicholas, New Year's, Christmas, the paradise trees, at one point these all just came together, and they're all part of what we celebrate with Christmas today. The stars on top of the Christmas tree. You know, the earliest record I could find of a star or anything on top of a tree, the topper, was that Windsor Castle picture of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, where they had an angel on the top of their tree. And I'm only tossing this out because nowadays we put angels or stars, the Star of Bethlehem, on top of our trees. Now, the Star of Bethlehem is traditionally a 5-pointed star. And I've seen people attack the stars too. And let me just throw this out here for you. Again, like, I don't know why we have to make everything sound more evil than it is. If I told you make a star, how many points would your star have? I think the easiest star to draw is a 5-pointed star. You can do that without lifting your pencil. But that's satanic. Pentagram. So you can't use a 5-pointed star. A 4-pointed star, that's kind of like a box. I guess a 4-pointed star can be a 4-pointed star. But a 6-pointed star, that's a Star of David. That's Jewish. Can't use that. And you go down the line. 7-pointed star, try and draw a 7-pointed star and tell me how you do. 8-pointed star, well, that's evil because of this. At the end of the day, people just put stars up there because there was a star related to the Christmas story with the Magi and with the Star of Bethlehem. And so, again, people can take things and just kind of run with it. But again, it's like the star is connected to the story of Christ. It might be a little after he was born, but it's connected. And it's why it ended up getting put on top of the tree. So, one last objection, just for something for you to consider and to pray about. People say, well, Christmas has been taken over by consumerism. I don't want a tree, and I don't want presents, and I don't want any of that stuff because people are ruining it. Well, again in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul has to talk to the church because the people were turning communion, the sacrament of communion, into a big party. There was drunkenness and gluttony involved with the Lord's Supper, the Lord's table. So what do? Well, obviously we should never have communion again. No, that's dumb. That just doesn't make sense. Just like we should never have a Christmas tree again because pagans have used Christmas trees. And just like, it's probably okay to keep on having sex with married couples, right? Because just because pagans did it doesn't mean we can't. Same thing with the Lord's Supper. Paul corrected them and said, why don't you just do it right? That's what you do. You don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, and that's throwing out the baby and the bathwater and half the bathroom with it. We just need to take religion back, take Christmas back, and make it a Christian thing. Can you use the Christmas tree to point to Christ? Martin Luther thought so. It's old tradition, and I can't give you a primary source, but the tradition's been around. Maybe Luther did it. But the tradition was that he has been attributed to be the first guy who put candles on the Christmas tree because walking home in the forest, looking at the beauty of God's creation and seeing the stars, he had a tree in the house already, it seems. And then they brought in the candles to bring the candles around the tree, and he wanted to teach his children about God's creation. It's not hard to help keep Christ the center of Christmas. And a good friend of mine, I even had him text while I was recording this, he confirmed part of one of their traditions that they give away all their presents before Christmas Day. They have kids open presents all week long, and by Christmas Day, there's no more presents, and they can just focus on Christ. Are we allowed to do that? You can do whatever you want. That's the whole point, is that we're not bound to these Christmas traditions, especially the tree and Santa and any of that stuff, but we're not forbidden to enjoy some of these things and to use these things to point to Christ. So rather than throwing out things that maybe have had a pagan tie in some weird way, shape, or form, or not, why don't we just take them back, like Paul told the Corinthians when it came to communion? It got abused. Okay, fix it. We don't do Santa with our kids. It doesn't fit in our family. But I'm not against Santa. And actually, every year, Judah, he's too big now, but we had this little, I think it came off a doll, I don't know, a little Santa costume. And he would wear it all Christmas long. Then Benny wears it, and I bet you Hannah's going to be wearing it soon. We don't worry about it. We're not stressed out. But when our kids ask, well, we don't tell them Santa's real, and we just try to make sure they don't tell other kids that so they don't ruin other family traditions. So, Santa Claus is tomorrow. We'll save that for then. Hopefully this is helpful to make you understand that Christmas trees have a historical tradition as a Christian practice. Whether or not you have to do it, that's up to you. You figure that out on your own. But don't let anyone make you feel bad because you want to have a Christmas tree in your house.